Forget the usual office drama about stolen lunches or loud phone calls. Today, we're digging into the HR files that made managers question their own sanity. These aren't just complaints, they're masterpieces of paranoia and absurdity. Get ready for 55 of the most bizarre, unhinged, and genuinely baffling grievances ever filed against a coworker. 1. In what might be the most metaphysical complaint ever filed, a man reported his coworker because his shadow was too aggressive. He claimed that when the afternoon sun hit the office just right, his colleague's shadow would stretch across his desk with an unsettlingly sharp and pointy shape. He described the shadow as having a hostile energy and demanded that his coworker be repositioned to a part of the office where his shadow would be rounder and more benevolent. 2. An employee in an IT department officially reported a colleague for blinking asynchronously, which he claimed was a deliberate psychological tactic. He insisted the coworker's left and right eyes were not blinking in unison, and that the fractional second delay was deeply unsettling, and a passive-aggressive attempt to disrupt his coding concentration. The complainant even submitted a slow-mo video from his phone as evidence, demanding HR investigate whether this was a conscious, malicious act or an involuntary display of untrustworthiness. 3. It wasn't about bad hygiene, it was about weaponized hygiene. A complaint was filed against a germaphobe vigilante who took it upon himself to sanitize everything and everyone. He would follow people out of the restroom, wiping the doorknob behind them, and would sneak up to desks to sanitize keyboards, often while people were still typing. The final straw wasn't a confrontation, but a creation. He unveiled a weekly hygiene leaderboard in the break room, publicly ranking employees on a scale from pristine to biohazard. The complaint was filed by the man who was ranked at the bottom as Patient Zero, stating this wasn't a health initiative, but a public shaming matrix, and that he was now a pariah in a kingdom of puerile. What's the most extreme hygiene habit you've ever witnessed? 4. One of the most legendary HR complaints came from a man who accused his colleague of methodically stealing the air from his side of the cubicle. He argued that his coworker was taking disproportionately large yoga-style breaths, and therefore rapidly depleting the oxygen levels in his personal workspace, causing dizziness. He requested that a floor-to-ceiling plexiglass partition be installed to ensure equitable oxygen distribution and prevent what he termed respiratory theft. 5. A woman lodged a formal, multi-page complaint against a coworker for having a suspiciously and unnaturally perfect posture. She wrote that his constantly straight spine and perfectly aligned shoulders, which never faltered even during a 10-hour workday, made everyone else feel physically and morally inadequate. She claimed his posture wasn't natural, but a calculated non-verbal power move, designed to assert dominance and silently judge his slouching colleagues. 6. An accountant filed a complaint against a co-worker for the truly monstrous way he ate a banana every day at 3 p.m. Apparently, he would take a single, precise bite directly out of the middle of the fruit, peel and all, and then place the gaping, wounded banana back on his desk for later. The complainant wrote that seeing the violated, brown-edged fruit was causing him significant emotional distress, and that the act itself was an affront to God and nature. 7. Get this. A man in a marketing department filed a formal report against his colleague for using his mechanical keyboard to tap out insults in Morse code. He claimed the distinct click-clack sounds weren't random, but a suspiciously rhythmic pattern. The complainant even submitted a log where he claimed to have translated the tapping using a phone app, deciphering phrases like, "Your presentation is boring," and "bad haircut." He accused the coworker of subliminal auditory bullying and demanded that HR provide the offender with a silent membrane keyboard to cease the coded harassment. 8. A graphic designer filed a detailed complaint alleging that his coworker was using a weaponized sigh to sabotage his creativity. He had created a spreadsheet documenting the date, time, and decibel level of every sigh the colleague emitted, claiming they were strategically deployed during brainstorming sessions. He described it not as a sign of tiredness, but as a sonic tool of discouragement that was audibly sucking the creative life force out of the room, one soul-crushing exhale at a time. 9. What does your coworker's laugh sound like? A gentle chuckle? A hearty guffaw? Or perhaps, and I quote, like a startled pterodactyl being tasered? That is the exact vivid phrasing used in an official complaint against a man whose laugh would erupt without warning. His deskmate claimed the sound caused sudden and severe cardiac distress throughout the open-plan office and formally requested the company send the man to laugh therapy. 10. An utterly bizarre complaint was submitted against a woman who brought a single, framed 8x10 photo of a hard-boiled egg to work. She placed it on her desk, facing her, and would occasionally just stop typing to stare at it and smile fondly. Her coworker reported that the unblinking ovoid presence was deeply unnerving and that he felt the egg was judging his work ethic. When HR gently asked the woman about it, she simply replied, "He's a good listener." The complaint was immediately escalated. 11. Squeak, squeak, squeak. That was the sound one employee endured for 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. He finally snapped and filed a formal noise complaint against his coworker's shoes, describing the sound not merely as annoying, but as a deliberate and rhythmic form of psychological warfare. He claimed in the report that the squeaking perfectly matched the tempo of the most irritating pop songs imaginable, and demanded that HR enforce a stealth footwear policy for the entire floor. 12. It started with a simple lava lamp on a coworker's desk. But then, he began claiming he could read the corporate future in the shifting wax blobs. He'd offer cryptic advice like, "The blobs are clumping near the bottom, Gary. Postpone the client call." Or, "The wax flows freely today. A good time to ask for a raise." The official complaint was filed when the complainant realized half the department was now making major business decisions based on the slow, hypnotic movements of a $30 novelty lamp. 13. Some office food crimes are unforgivable. But one complaint wasn't about the usual sin of microwaved fish for lunch. It was about microwaved fish and steamed broccoli for breakfast. At 9:05 a.m., every single morning. The complainant wrote that this aromatic assault was a violation of the Geneva Convention and that the pungent smell clinging to the air was making the quarterly reports taste of cod. Seriously, is there any food that should be permanently banned from the office microwave? Let me know in the comments. 14. One employee's cubicle looked like a hostage situation in a fairy tale. A woman filed a complaint stating her coworker's gnome army of over 20 figures was creating an atmosphere of constant surveillance. She was convinced their cold, painted-on smiles followed her every move, and that one gnome in particular, a fisherman named Pickles, was the ringleader. The report officially requested that HR interrogate the gnomes to determine their true intentions, forcing management into a serious meeting about the security threat posed by inanimate ceramic figures. 15. One of the most paranoid complaints involved a man reporting his deskmate for exhibiting an overwhelming number of spy-like characteristics. He had no actual evidence but listed his concerns. The coworker drank his coffee black, like a man with secrets, used a fountain pen which was obviously a hidden camera, and read a physical newspaper as a prop to observe others. The report ended with the plea, "He just has a very clandestine vibe, and it's making me nervous to leave my stapler unattended." 16. Imagine trying to get an urgent budget approval, and the response you get is a printed-out picture of the "this is fine" dog sitting in a burning room. An entire department filed a joint complaint against a coworker who refused to use email for replies and instead communicated solely through printed-out memes. A request for a meeting would be answered with a picture of a cat saying, "No." The complaint wasn't just about the inefficiency. It was about the sheer waste of paper and the impossibility of having a nuanced discussion with a piece of A4 paper featuring Salt Bae. 17. In the quiet savannah of the open-plan office, a new dominance ritual had emerged. An employee filed a grievance against his colleague for acoustical peacocking. Whenever the manager walked past their desks, his coworker would begin typing with the force of a jackhammer. He called it performative keystroking to signal superior productivity. At this point, HR wasn't sure if they were supposed to resolve an office feud or start organizing the company's first ever America's Loudest Typist competition. 18. You know what's incredibly strange? Working next to someone who narrates their own life in the third person. All day long, a complaint was filed against an employee named Dave, whose deskmate finally wrote to HR, "I can no longer listen to 'Dave is feeling thirsty now,' or 'Dave is going to conquer this spreadsheet.'" It's like working next to the play-by-play commentator for the world's most boring sporting event. Please, for the love of all that is holy, make Dave use I statements. 19. Paper clips are for holding paper. Rubber bands are for bundling things. But for one employee, they were his personal art supplies. This led to his coworker filing a complaint about the increasingly disturbing sculptures appearing on his desk, made entirely from pilfered office supplies. It started with a simple paperclip chain but had escalated to what was described in the report as a life-sized, anatomically questionable squirrel. The report cited the art as both a misuse of company property and a direct threat to office sanity. 20. The HR department received a complaint that seemed more suited for an exorcist than a corporate office. An employee filed a formal grievance against her coworker for allegedly haunting the break room coffee machine. She claimed the colleague would stand completely motionless in front of the machine for up to 10 minutes at a time, just staring at it, without ever making coffee. She described his presence as an unsettling, spectral loitering that imbued the entire kitchen with a creepy paranormal vibe. The complaint ended with a plea for HR to cleanse the break room's energy, or at the very least, ask the coworker if he was waiting for a message from the great beyond through the espresso maker. 21. The thermostat war is an office cliché, but one complaint elevated it to the level of international espionage. A woman accused her coworker of being a climate terrorist, claiming he had a sixth sense for the exact moment she achieved thermal comfort, at which point he'd sneak over to the thermostat and plunge the office into an ice age. She submitted a color-coded spreadsheet tracking the temperature attacks versus her goosebump frequency, and demanded HR install a lockbox on the thermostat, with the key held by a neutral, Swiss-like employee from a different department. 22. Subject: culinary monochromatism. That was the actual subject line of an email sent to HR. The complaint? An employee's deskmate had a diet that was a visual and psychological assault. On Mondays, he ate only red foods: strawberries, bell peppers, a bowl of marinara sauce. Tuesdays were orange. The complainant claimed that White Food Wednesday, consisting solely of rice, cottage cheese, and peeled apples, was the most soulless and depressing display she had ever witnessed, and it was casting a pall of beige despair over the entire team. 23. A complaint was filed against an IT technician whose every single email notification was the sound of a goat screaming in terror. Not a short clip. The full, long, guttural scream. The complainant, who sat right next to him, wrote that after the 47th goat scream of the day, he began to feel an unnatural kinship with the goat and was losing his ability to distinguish between an urgent work email and a farm animal experiencing a genuine crisis. 24. A formal complaint was filed against an employee for being too positive in the morning, to the point of being disruptive. The complainant stated that their co-workers' unrelenting cheerfulness and habit of booming "Good morning, Team Sunshine" upon arrival was creating a hostile work environment for everyone who hadn't finished their first life-sustaining cup of coffee. The document specifically requested that the co-worker be mandated to appear at least 15% more miserable until 10 a.m., suggesting a moratorium on smiling and direct eye contact. 25. A project manager filed a grievance against a team member for bringing an unauthorized consultant to every meeting. This consultant was a pet rock named Gary. She would place Gary on the conference table and, at critical moments, pause the discussion to ask for Gary's input, before announcing that Gary feels we're not thinking outside the box. The complaint stated this was deeply demoralizing, especially when Gary's silent opinion was consistently valued over the human team members. How would you handle a coworker asking a rock for its opinion in a serious meeting? Drop your strategy below. 26. It wasn't what he did, but what he didn't do. A complaint was lodged against an employee for his intense, unblinking focus on inanimate objects. The complainant stated his deskmate would suddenly stop working and just stare at his stapler for 5 to 10 minutes at a time without moving a muscle. He wrote, "I don't know what he thinks the stapler is going to do, but I feel like I'm witnessing the beginning of a very strange superhero origin story, and the pressure is immense." 27. One of the most meticulously documented complaints HR ever saw was titled, "The Case of the Midnight Chair Adjuster." An employee claimed a coworker was secretly staying late with the sole purpose of lowering his chair by exactly 1 inch every night. He submitted charts, graphs, and photographic evidence of the ergonomic sabotage, claiming it was a subtle, long-term campaign to destroy his posture and his spirit. He was absolutely convinced it was a power play. 28. A formal complaint was filed against the office's self-appointed birthday czar. The issue wasn't that she organized celebrations. It was the sheer, terrifying intensity. She would ambush the victim's cubicle with an explosion of streamers, force everyone into a 30-minute, off-key sing-along, and present a cake with a horrifyingly airbrushed photo of their face on it. The complainant, an introvert, wrote that he was living in absolute fear of his upcoming birthday and the mandatory joy that would be inflicted upon him. 29. Sometimes the creepiest things are the quietest. An employee reported her coworker for his disturbing horticultural practices. Every Wednesday, like clockwork, he would meticulously and lovingly water the dusty plastic plant on his desk. The complainant wasn't bothered by the act itself, but by the small, knowing smile he had while doing it. The report concluded with the chilling line, "I don't know what he's pretending to grow in that pot, but I am certain it's evil." 30. HR received a complaint that read like the beginning of a detective novel. "It's not the pens," the report began. "It's the caps." An employee accused his colleague of a campaign of psychological micro-theft. The coworker would never take the whole pen, only the cap. He would then leave the capless pen perfectly centered on the desk, an act the complainant described as a silent, symbolic message of chaos and disorder. He was convinced it wasn't about the plastic, but about sending a message that nothing is truly safe or complete. 31. One employee filed a report against his colleague for what he termed a descriptive and olfactory assault. The coworker wore a different, overpowering cologne each day, and when asked what it was, he'd never give a name. Instead, he'd offer a bizarre description like, "This one smells like a forgotten library during a thunderstorm," or, "Today, I'm wearing the essence of a pensive robot." The complaint stated that his cubicle now smelled like a haunted antique shop and demanded a policy of scent neutrality be immediately enforced. 32. There's LARPing, and then there's whatever this was. A complaint was filed against a new hire who insisted on speaking in a vaguely medieval dialect. He referred to the microwave as the sorcerer's magic box, the elevator as the rising iron chamber, and his manager as my liege. The final straw? He formally challenged a coworker to a duel of honor via email for taking his favorite stapler. HR was forced to write a company-wide memo explicitly stating that office disputes could not be settled with broadswords. What's the weirdest out-of-work hobby that has ever bled into your office? 33. In a nearly silent accounting office, the loudest sound every afternoon was the 3 p.m. apple. A woman filed a noise complaint against her coworker's apple-eating habits, describing each bite not as a crunch, but as a high-decibel acoustical event that shattered the sound barrier of professional decorum. She had even used a phone app to measure the sound, claiming it peaked at a level comparable to a freight train. She wasn't just annoyed. She was demanding HR intervene and regulate the acoustic impact of fruit consumption. 34. An employee was reported for a crime that was purely auditory and deeply maddening. His coworker filed a complaint about what he called recreational crinkling. The man would bring a large bag of chips to his desk, but instead of eating them, he would just rustle the bag in slow, long, deliberate crinkles for 5-minute intervals throughout the day. The complainant swore he rarely saw the man eat a single chip. It was just endless, agonizing crinkling. The report described the sound as the soundtrack to a slowly fraying sanity and formally requested that HR either provide the coworker with a stress ball or mandate that all his future snacks come in non-sonically abrasive packaging. 35. The HR manager stared at the complaint form, blinked, and read the key phrase aloud to her assistant: weaponized humming. A software engineer had officially reported her colleague for humming a single, unchanging musical note, a B-flat to be specific, for his entire shift. She claimed the monotonous drone was burrowing into her cerebral cortex and causing stress dreams scored entirely in B-flat. Her proposed solution? That the company mandate tonal re-education to teach him a more varied and less hostile range of notes. 36. An employee filed a report out of sheer confusion and concern for his deskmate, who would have loud, whispered arguments with himself. The problem wasn't the talking itself, but the fact that he was consistently losing these arguments to his imaginary counterpart. He'd slam his hand on the desk and mutter, "You're right, Otherberry, that was a stupid idea." The complaint expressed deep concern for the mental state of both the victor and the vanquished in these one-man debates. Have you ever had a coworker who argued with themselves and, more importantly, who won? 37. A junior employee was reported for his utterly bizarre email sign-offs. He never used best or regards. Instead, every email, no matter how mundane, was concluded with a cryptic and vaguely threatening quote. A request for new printer toner might end with, "The void gazes also into you," from Nietzsche. An update on a project timeline might conclude with, "May your enemies tremble before you." The complainant wrote that every email from this person now felt less like a work correspondence and more like an existential ultimatum. 38. Some people walk. Some people power walk. And then there was Brenda, who only ever walked backward. She claimed it was a mindfulness exercise that aligned her chakras. Her coworker didn't care about her chakras. He cared about workplace safety. The complaint was filed after Brenda caused a high-speed reverse collision with the coffee cart, sending a tidal wave of hot coffee across the sales floor. The report formally requested that HR create a policy on the mandated direction of forward momentum during business hours. 39. A truly baffling grievance was filed by an office worker because her deskmate was photosynthesizing too loudly. The person in question had cultivated a small rainforest on her desk, and the complainant swore she could hear the plants converting sunlight into energy. She described it as a high-pitched, persistent, chlorophyll-fueled hum that was giving her migraines and making it impossible to focus on spreadsheets. She demanded either the plants be relocated or the coworker be asked to have them photosynthesize more quietly. 40. A woman complained that her coworker's new dependent was disrupting the entire office. This dependent wasn't a child, but a Tamagotchi, the small digital pet from the 90s. The coworker would excuse herself from important meetings because it needed to be fed, would speak to it in a soothing baby voice, and even requested a day of bereavement leave when its battery died. The complaint stated that the constant, high-pitched beeping and the emotional coddling of a pixelated blob was officially more distracting than an actual infant. 41. It wasn't a drink of water, it was a full-blown production. A complaint was filed against a coworker for his performative hydration sessions. The report detailed how he would approach the water cooler, fill his glass with theatrical slowness, hold it to the light as if inspecting a fine wine, and then take a long, drawn-out gulp that was audible from 3 cubicles away. The act always concluded with a loud, full-body "ah" of satisfaction. The complainant stated that these twice-hourly performances were making it impossible to concentrate on anything other than the man's unquenchable and dramatic thirst. 42. A reign of terror began in the 4th floor break room. It wasn't about food theft, but something far more sinister. An employee filed a report about a cereal biter who would take a single surgical bite out of multiple people's lunches, a semicircle out of a sandwich, 1 scoop from a yogurt, a solitary forkful of salad. The complaint stated it wasn't about the loss of food, but the profound psychological violation. The unknown perpetrator was dubbed the lunch phantom, and the office lived in fear of whose meal would be the next victim of his culinary curiosity. What would you do if you found a single mysterious bite taken out of your lunch? 43. The file landed on the HR manager's desk with a thud. Inside was a 10-page manifesto detailing one employee's conviction that the Xerox Work Center 7845 was a deep state surveillance device. He claimed its rhythmic humming was actually it transmitting data, and that its occasional paper jams were a deliberate counterintelligence measure. He hadn't just filed a complaint. He had included hand-drawn schematics and demanded that HR immediately encase the entire machine in a custom-built tinfoil-lined box to block the nefarious signals. 44. Ever had a pirate week at the office? One team had to endure it, thanks to their method-dressing coworker. A complaint was filed against a man who would adopt a new historical persona every single week, complete with costumes and an accent. One week he was a Roman senator who would only answer to Tiberius. The next he was a 1920s gangster who called everyone C. The complaint was filed during Napoleon Bonaparte week, when the complainant stated he could no longer professionally debrief a man who had one hand tucked in his shirt and was demanding we refer to the marketing budget as his war chest. 45. An entire team filed a complaint against a senior accountant who refused to deliver negative feedback directly. Instead, he would only convey criticism through a worn-out sock puppet he called Frank the Fiscal Ferret. During code reviews or budget meetings, he'd put on the puppet and say things like, "Frank thinks your expense report is a work of fiction," or "Frank would like to point out that your math is frankly insulting." The complaint was filed after Frank the Fiscal Ferret viciously vetoed a major project proposal in front of the department head, leaving everyone in stunned silence, unsure if they'd just been professionally roasted by a piece of felt. 46. A woman filed a complaint against her deskmate's emotional support appliance. This wasn't a therapy dog. It was a rusty vintage desk fan named Breezy. The co-worker would talk to it, drape a little scarf over it when the office got cold, and scold people who walked in front of it, accusing them of blocking Breezy's personal space. The complaint stated that working next to a woman who was having a one-sided conversation with a small, oscillating turbine was actively eroding her own grip on reality. 47. The complaint wasn't about harassment, but about aggressive benevolence. A man reported his co-worker for constantly leaving him gifts of found treasures on his desk. The items included a perfectly smooth gray rock, a single child-sized glove, a bottle cap from a foreign brand of soda, and a strangely shaped twig. The complainant wrote that he was living in a state of constant anxiety, feeling trapped in a bizarre, unspoken barter system he never agreed to, and terrified of what would happen if he didn't display the items prominently. Have you ever received a workplace gift that was more confusing than kind? 48. Some workplace complaints are about big issues. Others are about 0.01% of a person's body. A colleague was formally reported for his left pinky fingernail, which was described as impossibly long and perfectly manicured. The complainant wrote that it was unsettling, and not conducive to a professional data entry environment. The report left the HR department wondering if they needed to update the company dress code to include regulations on individual digit grooming. What's the most bizarre physical trait you've ever seen someone get nitpicked for at work? 49. His name was Paul, but his unofficial title was Captain Obvious. A complaint was filed against him for his habit of narrating his every action as if he were a beta tester for the human experience. His deskmate reported hearing a constant monologue of, "Okay, I am now moving the mouse cursor over the save icon," or "I am about to take a sip of coffee, which is hot." The complainant wrote that he felt like he was trapped in a live-action instruction manual for the world's most basic tasks, and it was making him question his own intelligence. 50. A man was reported for his unnerving habit of social cataloging. He would stare intently at a coworker for a solid minute, then quietly type something into a password-protected spreadsheet. When HR finally confronted him, he calmly admitted he was creating a comprehensive database of coworker traits, including their estimated height-to-arm span ratio, their dominant typing fingers, and a log of their most frequently used adjectives. The complaint from his deskmate simply stated, "I don't know what the data is for, but I know in my soul I don't want to be on that list. Please make him stop cataloging me." 51. Forget bad coffee or stale donuts. One office's defining scent was, for some reason, buttered popcorn. A complaint was filed against an employee who perpetually smelled like a movie theater lobby. The complainant clarified it wasn't an unpleasant smell, but its constant, inexplicable presence was deeply unsettling. He wrote that the scent was so pervasive that he'd find himself craving a soda during important budget meetings, and that the entire office now had the surreal ambiance of a low-budget cinema. HR was forced to have a serious discussion with a man about his personal scent profile. 52. Some people have a morning routine. This guy had a morning ritual. An employee was formally reported for his habit of giving his computer monitor a loud, crisp high five every single morning when he arrived, and another one before he left. The complainant, who sat opposite him, stated that the daily jarring crack of palm against plastic was bad enough, but the real issue was the emotional inequity. The report genuinely asked, "Why does the monitor get a high five for its service and I don't? I work here too." HR was left to mediate a one-sided professional relationship between a man and his Dell widescreen. 53. He was a man who lived his life as a question mark. A complaint was filed against a coworker who, for 6 straight months, had allegedly not made a single declarative statement. Every interaction was a question. Is this coffee fresh? Are my TPS reports satisfactory? Is it lunchtime yet? The complainant wrote that this had placed the entire psychological burden of confirming reality on his shoulders, and that he was on the verge of a breakdown from having to constantly validate his coworker's existence. What's the most passive-aggressive communication style you've ever had to deal with? 54. A man filed a formal grievance against his entire team for what he called crimes against stationery. He was a devout believer that all office supplies had a spirit and were being systematically abused. In his report, he cited the torture of bent paper clips, the life force draining of a pen used until it's dry, and the percussive violence of aggressive stapling. He wasn't asking for a warning. He was demanding the company provide mandatory sensitivity training on the ethical and humane treatment of inanimate office tools. 55. A complaint born from a level of psychological intrusion that belongs in a thriller movie. An employee was being followed and documented by his deskmate, who had appointed himself as his unauthorized biographer. He would shadow him to the break room, taking meticulous notes on his snack selection patterns, and type furiously after every phone call. The complainant found a draft on the printer with chapters titled "A Study in Mediocre Coffee Breaks" and "The Illusion of Productivity." The final straw wasn't the manuscript itself. It was when the biographer sent a formal meeting request to the complainant's wife, asking for an interview to add depth and color to the subject's early years. It's a miracle any actual work gets done in between all the psychological warfare. Now, I want to hear from you. What's the single most bizarre, unhinged complaint you've ever witnessed at work? Let the chaos commence in the comments below. If this made you feel better about your own office, hit that like button and subscribe for more.